My name is Roy. This is a model of a new form of engine called the Whipper OCC. There are a number of different models of this engine. What I'm going to do during the course of this video is go through some piston engine fundamentals, and then I'll demonstrate the engine, and then I'll try to talk about what I think it means. This is a single piston engine. The piston takes fire on both sides. This engine is made of a bunch of thrown away junk. I use paint cans for my pistons. There's a 1 1/4 length of paint can in this engine at this time that I'm using for my piston. That piston has been cut out. That paint can has been cut out so you can also see the crank. This is the model that I've made. As you can see, this is a handle on it. It comes directly off the crank, and this is its name, the Whipper OCC. OCC stands for one cycle engine with a crank. All Whipper engines are one cycle engines, and the direct comparison that I make with them is to a 4-cylinder, 4-cycle engine, because it's roughly the same as that. An engine this size, because it is a 1-cycle engine, displaces, as compared to a 4-cylinder, 4-cycle engine, displaces 1,000 cubic inches, which is an awful lot. This is the crank with a handle on it. What you see going back and forth is my paint can piston, and you're barely getting a look at the crank at this time. You'll get a much better view at a later moment. These white bands on the end of the crank simply represent location for piston rings. Now I'll go ahead and try to get a little more specific with this. These 2 paint cans on the end, one of which has been cut out, represent the compressor pistons. They run through tubes, and there should be more than I have represented. And because the reason that I have twin sets of tubes coming off of each compressor is because in my mind, this will be a dual-acting compressor. It will compress in both directions, and it compresses the air intake, which goes into these channels right here, which circle the engine, and they're located on top of this circumnavigational porting on the engine. Since it's a 1-cycle engine, that means that both ends of the piston have to fire on every stroke. I'll go through the compression and ignition sequence for the engine itself. When the piston is at the bottom of its motion, the compressor pistons, having driven air into this chamber, will supply pressurized air to these intake ports. When this piston is at the bottom of its motion, this compressed air, of course, will be released in there. I'll show you them in a moment, but there are exhaust valves in the head. And when this gets to the bottom of its motion, which is right about now, alright, these valves are actually down. You'll see that in a moment. They're just plastic bottle cap valves, but they demonstrate just fine. So when the piston is at the bottom of its motion, on the left side piston, as you're looking at this, it's receiving pressurized air. The exhaust valves are open, alright, and in the version of this engine that I have in my mind, there's actually going to be a squirrel cage fan built into the exhaust pipe some distance down it, and it'll be providing a vacuum on the other side of those exhaust valves. So you'll have both moderate compression, no more than 3 or 5 psi, moderate vacuum representing just 1 or 2 psi negative pressure. But together, combined with good venturi action by angling these vents so that the air moves up through the cylinder as if it were a wall of air, you'll be able to get fast exchange. One of the reasons that this works is because there's a range of motion about 60 degrees in which you can see the piston barely moves. All right, this engine takes advantage of that range of motion, which is a relative pause in the piston's action to allow this action to happen. So the piston is at the bottom of its stroke. It's taking in fresh air. It will be a fuel injected engine, so all it's taking in down here is air. As the piston is driven to the top, I'll explain that to you in a moment, you might be able to see the crankshaft turning in there just a little bit. The crankshaft has one throw on it and one connecting arm going to one end of this single piston. So as the piston drives up, it goes through its compression stroke, it hits the top, it hits ignition, and as it hits the top of its stroke, the piston on the other side is now clear. The compressor pistons have each moved to the other end to supply compressed air to this side there of the engine. The same thing is happening here that I just described a second ago. And so now this end of the engine fires. You know, we have exchange of air on this end and fresh air. The exhaust valves have been smacked open. This particular model has 3 exhaust valves. You can have, in a higher performance engine, I think you'd want 4. And so now the piston drives down from its ignition, and it's in the ignition phase. It's driving this side of the engine up. For the compression phase, it reaches the top of its stroke. It fires. As this end reaches the top of its stroke, this end of the compressor piston comes down and hits the valves on the top. That opens everything up in this chamber, allowing compressed air to be delivered through the intake. Exchange of air, like I said, vacuum on the exhaust. Then you roll through, you have ignition on this end, and the cycle seeks to repeat itself. The piston rolling on down through. I've come out of my mounting on that side. And the piston rolls on down through. You get compression in this end, and then that's it. I mean, like any piston engine, all the piston does is go back and forth. In this case, it fires every 180 degrees. What that means is every stroke is an ignition stroke. That's why it's a 1 cycle. The ignition phase itself is, after it's in the ignition phase, in order to make everything happen here, the piston comes down and acts as its own intake valve. When it comes down and the rings clear, this series of holes here built into the case. And you know, like I said, compressed and vacuum-assisted exchange of air, taking advantage of that motion in the piston where the piston isn't doing much as it's changing direction, and then away you go. Okay. The crankcat, this is a very simple little crank. It's just made out of old plumbing pipe, and the only thing it lacks is a counterweight. What you're looking at here is the single throw in the crank, and then the connecting rod. And I'll go ahead and send it through one complete revolution for you. There it is. So of course, when it fires on this end, it's acting much like a conventional connecting rod. When it fires on this end, it's a little bit different, but not much. And so that's about it. You can see it's extremely simple. This is just that paint. The thing about this engine is I thought this video was going to be much longer, but the engine's so simple it's not hard to explain it. Down here, if the camera can pick that up, you can see the exhaust valves actually moving. You know, my pop can lid exhaust valves, and that of course happens when the piston's at the bottom of its stroke, like I said before. So that's it. The weight of the crankcase is gone, essentially. The whole engine is more or less a piece of pipe with 2 compressor engines. You can achieve the same thing with air by putting on by taking this casing here and just running squirrel cage fans to drive your air. In this case, I wanted to show you a model of the engine in which all of its major functions are covered, except for generating electricity, which could actually happen by putting some coil and magnetizing this this compressor piston, which isn't going to generate, of course, anywhere near as much heat. What you're looking at is just a piece of pipe. This is the production models of this are going to need a water jacket, and that's it. One thing I'm pretty sure this engine does is it makes the age of the Jetsons mechanically possible. Okay, this collar that you see represented here that's connected to the body of the engine and has the air exchange pipes coming into it. It has one from one end and one from the other end to coordinate getting compressed air from these dual acting pistons. This is a list of the Whipper engine types. The Oco is a one-cycle engine, just like this, with one moving part in the drivetrain because it lacks a crankshaft. The OCC is a one-cycle engine with a crank, and I pronounce that OCC. I use a hard C sound for the Oco. The Oco and the OCC can come as 2, 3, and 4 piston engines, but understand 4 pistons in an Oco or an OCC equal a 16-piston 4-cycle engine. The advantage of this engine over a 4-cycle and a 2-cycle engine are pretty inherent and obvious. It's going to have a power to weight ratio that's about 2.5 to 1 over a 2-cycle engine. It's going to have a power to weight ratio of about 4.5, 4.6 to 1 over a 4-cycle engine. America went from external combustion, which is the steam engine, to internal combustion, which is the internal combustion engine. That caused a revolution, and it was a revolution in engine design. Power went up about 40%, weight was decreased about 60%. Instead of having to go out and run a fire in your car for half an hour before you could drive off, as is the case with the Stanley Steamer, people could just get out there and pull the choke and start it. This engine represents a similar revolution within the internal combustion engine itself. Okay. This Whipper is an OCC, a one-cycle crank, single piston in the ignition phase, with 2 compressor pistons to drive air intake. The crank is inside the piston, which has an ignition chamber on both ends. The heads have 3 exhaust valves only in each. There is 1 connecting rod. Thank you for listening to this little video. I hope you've enjoyed it. This is a major piece of progress with the internal combustion engine. It's going to make a big difference for our country and the world, I believe.